Hey
So,
everybody, welcome to this episode of HITRUST Secrets. This is Sue Richards here with Donna Dodson and Jeff McHugh. So the core group here today, small audience, but definitely some big topics that we're tackling. So um, we're just now talking about the difference between different assessors, even sometimes even within the same third-party assessment organization, and how they approach the HITRUST certifications, especially corrective actions. So. Let's keep talking.
sure. I've just been a little bit surprised on the different requirements from the assessors and indeed different assessors within similar like within the same agency or firm, and really looking at what their requirements are, and they just seem so different. So I wonder what the experience is like going into high trust and whether a slightly smaller or more efficient statement, even on the assessors who are, thinking it needs to be very robust, would be acceptable for high trust. Because if they're accepting all of them, and that has been what I've seen,
Hmm.
I'm just wondering whether or not that additional level of detail is required, or if
Now you're
it's,
saying level of detail in the comments or the level
yeah,
of
in
detail?
in the
Okay.
response,
In the
in the
response, in the,
response for the
okay.
corrective action.
Oh, okay.
Because I
Within the corrective
usually
action itself.
encourage, yeah, so I usually encourage my clients to keep it fairly high level.
Hmm.
Don't commit to a specific solution. If you want to say you're going to look at these types of solutions, that would be good. But, try to avoid committing to a specific solution or naming or, you know, giving exact giving exact milestones and that sort of thing, because you don't, until you're in the weeds of it, in the middle of that
Hmm.
implementation, and even then things change and things evolve. I mean, that's that is the nature of projects, business projects, technology
Yeah.
projects. That's the way it goes. So to avoid them being in a sticky spot or an awkward situation trying to explain why they didn't go down a certain path, I just encourage them to keep it high level, right? Um,
Yeah. And I
but
think
I,
seeing that change, seeing how maybe a
yeah.
milestone changes or even a task within or a date or something like that, I think that shows the authenticity of people are really trying to close those
Hmm.
and do those corrective actions. If everything seems so perfect and, exactly what I said a year and a half ago is exactly the date that we closed it, it seems to me almost that either it was too easy. And so you cleared it probably 3 months ago and you're just catching up on paperwork, or you just kind of paid lip service to it. Oh, yeah, we're going to change our procedure to do this. And see, our procedure has a sentence in it now. Um, but as far as the assessor, I would probably look at what the experience is of each of those assessors. Um,
Mm.
because I do know within one organization, you know, I'll be working with one assessor who's very precise, wants everything, named by the control number, et cetera, et cetera. And then I have others that are like, yeah, if you just, tell me what it is, I'm good. We can have a conversation and talk through it. So
Hmm.
it does definitely, I think there's leeway there. And I think HITRUST wants that
Hmm.
leeway there as far as the approach to it, provided the evidence is at the level that it needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, I'd always hit the dates, but it's because I always put the dates comfortably out and
Right.
then agreed with leadership. These are the other dates, these nearer term dates are the
Right.
ones that are actually the internal target dates for the team, so that we're never going to miss. Because that's, like I said, several years ago, the impression, uh, the direction that I was provided from high trust is, this is the date. You must hit this date. There is no deviation on the date. I was like,
Right. Yeah. Which
okay.
obviously you're going to
So
add
I
more.
just
And yeah.
basically put all the target cap
Hmm.
completions out for the next assessment, because they don't really check them sooner. So there's not a lot of reason to pick a sooner date. You just need it then, so that you've got your target completion, you know what you've got to do, you've got your evidence, and you go into the next assessment.
Right. Well, and as that facilitator of that audit, you can't, if you've got a large number of corrective actions, you can't manage all of those simultaneously. So
No.
better that you stagger those out as well, because you typically are not that control owner. So you're working
Hmm.
with those different departments who have long forgotten 3 months after the high trust assessment is done. They've long forgotten you and the fact that they were
Yeah.
going to get whatever that new process was put in place. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
remember, we've got to do this. And you don't know, because a lot of times in the past you were trying to get that corrective action plan together within 5 days because
Hmm.
your certification was hanging in the balance. Now you get all that ahead of time before you submit it to high trust because you know it in advance. Okay, these are the corrective actions we're going to have, and so you have a little bit more leeway as far as working with those, because you're in the midst of that working with those control owners then, and can
Hmm.
say, oh, we're lacking on this evidence, we're lacking this control. How can we implement it, as opposed to waiting 3 months when high trust QA comes back and says, oh, here's some corrective actions that you need to do. And then you have
Hmm.
to, jog their memory and go, okay, commit me to a date. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
so I think their process has changed as well. But, and I wonder if because, version to version, the controls are different, that they're kind of like, well, as long as you're making some progress on those, and as long as, they're raising the bar as it goes anyway. So even
Hmm.
corrective action, done or not, they're going to see it in the next assessment a year from now or 2 years from now, because that
Yeah.
bar has been raised from where it was
Yeah.
when you first went
No,
through
that makes
that
sense.
older one.
That makes sense. And it's a bit more comfortable. I just wanted to make sure
You weren't
that I
missing, and
hadn't,
yeah,
yeah,
all
that
of
I
a sudden they
wasn't
weren't going to
missing
go,
something
nope.
basically. Because I certainly don't want to steer my clients wrong. And,
Right.
I'll check with high trust and double check with high trust, but I don't like to torture their customer support team either. I mean, if it says this and that's what it's supposed to be, but the handbook versus the lived experience is different
Right.
sometimes. So my experience with the support team is that they systematically direct to the handbook, which is fine. But usually I've checked that before I contacted them.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and I'll have to go back, because I know, like, in an interim assessment, there's 3 questions the assessor has to answer before they can
Hmm.
even get in and look at the evidence. But I don't know if progress on the corrective actions is one of those 3 questions. I know one is, has the assessed entity had a breach? Have any of those, has the scope changed?
Hmm.
But I can't remember the third one, but I don't know if it's related to the corrective actions
I
or
can't
not.
remember. I don't know because I've never been an assessor, so I've never come across those questions. And I they've maybe checked with us on a couple of things, but
Right.
I don't know that I've got visibility on everything.
Interesting. All right.
Yeah.
More questions than answers, but we need to get Richard or one of our other assessors in to say, well, what's your perspective on this? And maybe it's kind of the same way you do a regular audit, where you kind of gauge the the progress from those initial interviews with people, and
Hmm.
if they're being evasive, or yeah, we're doing it all, then you're like, okay, well, it's time to dig a little deeper. And
Yeah.
if you feel like they're just telling you what you want to hear, then maybe you fine tune it. But I'd be curious to
Yeah.
just have a conversation with a couple of those assessors to just, hey, what's your background? How long have you been doing high trust? What were what else do you do? Because
Hmm.
maybe it's a PCI approach or a SOC 2 approach or something like that they're kind of taking as the basis
Hmm.
of how they approach corrective actions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that leads me into the comments. When you're commenting, and when I first was doing a high trust assessment, I had custom comments for each and every one of the controls. And now I find I'm kind of more generic when it goes, yes, the evidence shows that, especially now that you can link the evidence directly to each control. I just kind of
Hmm.
go, yeah, the evidence is attached that supports this,
Hmm.
as opposed to here's what we do and how we do it, and all of that. Probably less so because comments aren't typically included anymore in the report. I mean, you can choose to opt in and have
Yeah.
comments included.
Well, it's yeah, it's not great. It's quite it's a dirty version of a report. I mean, that to have all the commentary in there. So I I wouldn't choose to do it. I mean, it's one thing to know that you've got to share that between yourself and your assessors and
Mhm.
HITRUST to make sure that there's an appropriate level of transparency. It's another thing to, put the dust that was under the rug on the front mat for your guests to track through.
No, what I'm saying is like
Do you know what I mean?
I just kind of become very generic when it comes to a comment. It's like,
I have, but it depends on what the assessors want in those comments. It depends on what the leadership team at the company wants in the comments. It depends on how many different people are filling out those comments. And so that's where I strongly encourage companies not to put the comments in their report. And I've
yeah,
even seen
yeah.
HITRUST encourage not to put the comments in the report because while I agree with you, if I've got to fill out all the comments, I tend to get quite generic at different points, but it like not everybody does, and people don't understand what's visible. And I strongly encourage people not to go down that path
Mhm.
because it just really is like putting all your dirty laundry on the front porch.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the only time I put a custom comment in is if I have a not applicable. If there's something that I'm
Mhm.
saying is not applicable, I don't obviously say it's not part of the scope. I do put in the rationale behind why I feel like that control does not apply for that
Mhm.
particular situation. But the rest of the comments are typically very, very generic. Um,
Yeah.
but I've
Yeah, no, I
noticed
think,
like when you inherit, sometimes the cloud providers are very verbose, and other times they kind of fall into that generic too.
Mhm.
Donna, I think I hear you saying treat it like a deposition. Answer the question only.
Yeah, I mean, and I
It is.
almost feel like my generic comment sometimes is just, I appeal to the evidence that I've attached to prove to you that I'm doing this, because you start getting, 250, 300 controls in, you start kind of feeling a little loopy going, what do I say about this control?
Mhm.
How do I talk about the inventory of assets yet again? So just being like, evidence attached, here you go.
Yeah. It's hard because especially with the multi component controls, they oftentimes are looking for, well, how are each one of these components met? And I have gone to the extent of, page numbers for policies, page numbers for procedures, or at least page ranges. Like if there's 8 pages, what you want is on page 2 and 3. So narrowing it down a bit like that. But even to that end, it's still like those are fine for internal comments. They're fine for high
Mhm.
trust. They're necessary even for HITRUST and the assessors. So that's not nobody in the public needs that,
No,
you
no,
know?
absolutely not. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely not. All right. Well, that leads me to another question that I had, or something that I kind of thought was interesting that I wanted to share. Um, all right. So we were talking about this a little bit ahead of time. There's my handy dandy high trust assessment handbook, which I download a copy of it. We also have it. Let me see if I can find it. I also have it here because it is live, and we put the link in the chat, and for YouTube I'll put it in the description. Um, but looking at the table of contents, I was actually looking for something else, but this I came across when I looked at the appendix. They had not applicable examples and then never not applicable examples. So I wanted to walk through some of those because I thought they were interesting. So here's a couple examples of not applicable. And this is kind of this middle column is kind of the context of when it would be not applicable. Um, so, if you've got this control in domain 3, protects and controls media containing sensitive information during transport outside of controlled areas. A lot of times, you think about, well, your controlled area would be your server room or your cloud. And then this would be, how are you pulling that information out? And I think of that more like tape backups, physical backups or something like that. And so, you don't have any portable media. You're not letting people have USB drives. That's all locked down. So in this case, you would kind of say, okay, well, you know, this would be a not applicable where you're like, okay, there's no way to transport this unremovable media because we don't allow for removable media. So you're good on that one. This one I thought was interesting that that you're specifying. Oh no, not that one. Hang on. Oh, here. Firewalls are configured to deny or control any traffic from a wireless environment into the covered or confidential data environment. So that's, making sure you've got good, strong firewalls and you're segmenting off your network. This can be not applicable if you don't have wireless access points. So if you don't support wireless access points in your environment, then this control can be not applicable. However, and we'll go through the rest of these, a couple of these not applicable examples, but when you go to the never not applicable examples, the very first one in here, the context is you don't have wireless access. But quarterly scans performed to identify unauthorized wireless access points. A lot of times you think, well, I don't have wireless access, so I'm not doing quarterly scans of my environment to make sure. But HITRUST is like, no, this should never be not applicable because they're looking for a detective control. So they're looking for you as an assessed organization to make sure that you're looking for unauthorized wireless access points. So even if you don't support it, you want to make sure that somebody isn't trying to mimic your environment and people are logging in or attaching to that wireless network thinking it's your organization. So, so I've got to go back to a couple of the ones I'm doing and make sure that that I don't. I think like if you're fully remote, if you don't have a corporate office headquarters, then obviously that can be not applicable. But if you have a corporate office, even if you're not allowing wireless access there, you would not want to make this not applicable. You'd want to be able to explain how you're making sure there are no wireless.
That's a good description. Thanks for that, Susan.
Yeah. Same here with mobile devices, because a lot of times BYOD, we're like, no, we don't allow BYOD. But again, this is monitoring for unauthorized connections of mobile devices. Even if you're not allowing BYOD, you don't allow phones in that scoped environment, HITRUST expects a detective control to make sure that nobody's logging in and connecting in. So another interesting, never non-applicable. So
that's a good section in the book. I'm glad
isn't
that you
it?
pointed that out.
I know. I was like, this to me is something I was like, oh, I'm going to go through all of these. And then maintain equipment with dial-up. This is one that I know, we're always like, dial-up? Nobody does that anymore. But they're wanting to make sure that, again, that you're detecting that you're not allowing dial-up capabilities. So again, it's just to make sure that, okay, you've configured this, but how do you make sure that somebody hasn't reconfigured it or, exploited something that you may not have been expecting?
Yeah, I think it's more about the monitoring and the configuration, checks and validation, because it's not really looking for you to prove a negative, right? So
Right.
you can't, it's very difficult to prove nobody
ever, but
did a
this is a
dial-up,
periodic
right?
look at,
All
yeah.
you can really do is say, well, this is the monitoring we have in place, and this monitoring showed these connections. All you can do is
Right.
show the positive
Or
and not the negative,
right.
because trying to prove a negative statement is in some cases literally not possible. So
Yeah.
it's just trying to understand what they're after and then seeking that perspective. How do I demonstrate this, for them to be confident in this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because like it's the same with firewall rules. You can have the best procedures about how you're locking down all of your firewall rules, but over time, somebody's going to open a ticket to request a port being opened for a specific business need. And it's kind of and then you're going to have another one and another one. And suddenly you need somebody to kind of take a look at it at least once a year and look over the entire landscaping. Okay, are any of these rules contradicting other rules that have been put in? And are they contradicting the policies that we have? Maybe it was a firewall port needed to be opened for a defined period of time during a migration, but nobody ever remembered to put the ticket in to close that again. And it's very similar to that I see with these, that that you've got it configured, that something's monitoring it, hopefully an automated monitoring, and it's not something you have to manually walk around, looking for wireless
Mhm.
access points. Um, and then you've got some sort of maybe notification that, hey, somebody's tried to do this or we've warded it off, et cetera. So it's, not necessarily an active control you have to do. It's something that you maybe have in place to just say, well, it can't have happen, and here's how we prevent that from happening. And we make sure that that control is in place and operating, by periodically checking for it.
Yeah. And this is where security councils or governance committees can be very handy for an organization, even a smaller one. You don't have to have a ton of people on your security council. It can be 3 or 4. It doesn't have to be a council of 20. And the governance committee is the same way. So the way I would split those out is governance committee is more about the decisions for the entirety of the organization, the business, how you literally govern different teams and processes and how you approach things and what your overall policies need to be, that sort of thing. Includes cybersecurity, HR, health and safety, finance, so you've got all those core areas in governance committee. Security council is more cybersecurity focused, but they're a great opportunity. If you need an exception to something, then you can have this is back to my SharePoint dashboards. You submit a request to the security council, and then, that's allocated to a meeting and a conversation takes place, and then you document, you fill in a field in SharePoint and say the committee discussed, this is what was decided. And then you've got, an approver, or we used to have at one of the companies I worked at, we had to have 2 approvers had to have 2 people confirming for an approval, only 1 person to decline. So any 1 person could decline something, but if you were going to get an approval, you needed 2, and they needed not to be from the same team. It was a bigger organization, right? So I don't want any of the smaller organizations to get scared off on that. But that's having these committees, and then having somebody from security council can, report up to leadership or over to the governance committee. These are really good core, ways of reviewing and monitoring from a leadership perspective what is happening, what should be happening, if corrective action needs to be taken. And then it is, documenting the minutes. And I don't want anybody to feel like they have to share everything that goes on in those leadership meetings. You can absolutely, obscure some of the data. Like the assessors are looking for very specific sound bites. They're looking to make sure the meetings take place. They're looking to make sure key conversations take place. Not everything you send through, you don't have to send it through completely available. You can actually,
Right. We've
go through
discussed 2 incidents or something like that. You don't have to give the specifics of those incidents, just,
right. If employee names are referenced with
Right.
those or anything, you can obscure all of that. It doesn't
Right.
need to be shared in the context of the minutes. But those are really good things to put forward. Then, when you have an exception to something, you can prove like this is the exception that was made. This is why it was a very specific circumstance.
Right.
And what you're looking for are justifications, guardrails, and decommissioning when it's done. And
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
if it's on that list, what you want, and this is where exceptions, if you've got a security council or a governance committee or an ESG committee, you can call it whatever you want. But if you've got some sort of a review board, then you can, if you've made an exception for something for a very finite period of time, put it back on the agenda, right? Just leave it open at the end. That way you don't close it out until it's been decommissioned.
Right. Yeah. And if you've got some sort of a tracking tool to be able to say, okay, this exception is going to be reviewed. And if it's, maybe a low priority or a low risk exception, it could be maybe reviewed every 6 months. In 6 months, we're going to look at this and see, do we need to keep this exception or can we now close it? But yeah, I mean, I tell clients all the time that it's not that HITRUST is asking you to be perfect, because you can have an exception process, because any rule, I mean, that's the whole point of a rule. It's like, okay, if you have a
Yeah.
rule, chances are you're going to need an exception to that rule in some circumstance.
Mhm.
So it's a matter of making sure that you're very aware of what those exceptions are and that somebody's managing those. Somebody's asking that question, well, what's the
Mhm.
business need of why we need this? How long do we need this for? And then somebody can evaluate that risk and say, okay, well,
Mhm.
the risk of doing this, the risk of sending an unencrypted USB with, whatever, here's the risk for that to the business, and then have a business owner sign off on that. So it's not the
Mhm.
information security department saying no, it's the
Mhm.
information security department saying, here's what would happen if we don't have this control in place in this narrow circumstance. And letting
Mhm.
the business say, yep, the reward is worth that risk. So here's what we're going to do. And then any controls you can put around it to further safeguard is
Mhm.
important. But to have it open only for a specific period of time and then reevaluate, do we still need to have this? Did we get that data back? Do we
Mhm.
get confirmation that that data was destroyed, et cetera, et cetera? And just be able to have that documented in a way that to an auditor coming back, 6 months or a year later, you can say, yep, we did this, we looked at it, needed to do it for the business reasons,
Mhm.
but we went on from there and closed it.
Yeah. Yeah, those committees are also a good way to get approval for
Mhm.
things when you're not quite sure who to ask. And if you have found somebody to ask, they might not be sure if that's wholly up to them,
Right.
versus a shared decision. And so by establishing those councils or committees, you then have a place to go to raise this. And they can deflect it and say, oh no, that falls under so and so's remit. They can make that decision on their own. That would fall within their budget. Or they can take it on and say, oh right, yes, let's have a discussion on this and see if we're all in agreement, because this is a project that wouldn't fall within any of our remits or budgets. And so we have to figure out where the funding is going to come from, and who needs to be involved in it, if it's an ongoing process or key milestones or whatever.
Yeah.
And a
And
lot
you
of
may
times,
turn around,
especially
there
with
may be a
growing
better
companies, they
solution.
do that.
There may be a better solution that somebody hasn't thought
Mhm.
of. You as that business owner may be going, okay, here's the only way I can see to solve this. And you actually bring
Mhm.
up the business problem and go, this is what I'm trying to solve. And somebody may go, well, instead of, sending them a physical USB, let's get them a secure FTP protocol and
Mhm.
pull the data
Mhm.
that way or something like
Yeah.
that. So there could be other options that you didn't think about as that business owner. And so instead of circumventing the rule, go, oh, I can still live within that rule. In some
Mhm.
cases, you can't, and you need the exception, but at least that way, you've got two or three other people with their perspectives looking at that problem and helping you solve it, as opposed to
Mhm.
just saying, nope, can't do it. It goes against the rules.
Yeah. Yeah. And pragmatically, from a logistics perspective, it's a great way to make sure that you're not double purchasing things. Because I have seen so many companies, especially, where they're recently coming out of a startup stage or a super small company, less than 100, maybe even sometimes less than 50 people. And so if somebody needs something, it's a little bit more casual, a lot more casual about how they purchase it. But then as they grow, once you get over 100 people, you need a central list. What are the
Mhm.
systems that you have? What do they do? What do you use them for? Right? Because you might use them for something, but they might have all this other functionality. And that's where understanding it, especially with a trusted partner or somebody who's already gone through the vendor, assessment or security, parameters, can make life a lot easier when
Mhm.
you're trying to get that new functionality. It also means, from a cost perspective, you're not paying for two different systems that in the end actually cover the same functionality.
Yeah, yeah, because there are silos
It's
of
crazy.
departments, and if this group grew up using this solution for secure email or
Mhm.
transport or something like that, and somebody else is using a completely different system, without somebody being in the middle to know where all that is and who's doing it, and your finance department doesn't know the solutions and why they're what problem they're solving. They're just making sure, that okay, somebody's authorized this work or this product or this service, and we're going to make sure it gets paid, versus having somebody else who can kind of look at it and go, but what are we using this for? Why do we have this? And kind of seeing where that spend is going to say, well, we've also got this, and we can just add licenses here. Um,
Hmm.
I was able to do that
Yeah.
with with one organization. They had a very small number. They were using a very proprietary secure email system, and they only had, I think, a license for 10 people to use it. So they were always, okay, this person doesn't have it today, and this person needs it, or funnel all of your, encrypted stuff to this person, and send it out that way. And we were able to save money by doing a whole company solution that allowed everybody to be able to send encrypted email, which was
That
nice.
is, I struggle to wrap my head around that.
Well, it was just that what they had
That's
grown
a
up with,
terrible use
and
of people's time.
right. Yep.
Oh
But these were a
dear.
lot of field offices, and so they didn't want, the field, but the field are the ones interacting, and so they're like, well, let me just send that to you, and that, oh, you didn't know you weren't supposed to send that directly. You're supposed to send that to so and so who could send it encrypted to that person, and finally was like, no, let's just do it so the whole company can send encrypted.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's, making sure that you've got that centralized information because, so there was a small situation there and you were able to solve it by going to a company-wide solution, especially when it comes to security or, high risk information. Sometimes it's only a very limited number of people who have access or awareness even of the solution.
Mhm.
So what happens then if you don't have a central repository of all your vendors and all your solutions and all your functionality, and then the two people who use that solution leave, and it's on a credit card, on a corporate card
Exactly.
or invoiced, and finance is like, yep, that's fine, we always do that, why would they know it's tied to two people who aren't there
Exactly.
anymore?
Exactly.
And then it just keeps getting approved because that's how the contract was written. It's a roll on, there should be contract reviews, subscription reviews. These are things that even for a small company, if you bought a dentist office, you subscribe to things, a few
Hmm.
years ago, and
Yep.
the magazines that come into your waiting room, that's one thing. It's easy to see. They arrive every month. Whoever gets the mail sees the magazines. What about the subscriptions for the systems behind the scenes? Those are very difficult because sometimes nobody sees it. It
Right.
just keeps
Or you
getting
don't
charged.
know, and so you don't want to stop it because you're like, well, I don't know what I'm going to, what
Yeah,
I'm going to affect, and I mean, the scream test is effective, but you don't want to use it all the time and just go,
not
let me turn
ideal.
that off and see
It's
who
not
yells at
ideal.
me.
Yes. But I have been in that situation before where we couldn't figure out, who was using what. And, then if you've got tech like that, not only is it a risk, that lack of a list or a centralized,
Hmm.
running monitoring of all of those systems and partnerships, but what information do you have on your company that's out there? Is there an integration with any of your systems that should be shut down?
Exactly.
How long is it out there?
Yeah.
And, not having a clear list of all the APIs that your system is plugged into, that's a it's not recommended because then how
Yeah.
are you actually, securing your system and your data and your business?
Yeah, don't know.
Yeah.
How
And
can
there
you?
are so many integrations. I mean, there's just so much that does go on. And, Salesforce is integrated with this, and your email's integrated with that. And even your security awareness training is, integrated with your identity and access management. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot. It was funny.
I was,
I was at a CISO dinner the other night, and we were talking about how the different skills sets that are needed for a CISO. And
mhm,
we all kind of were, like, because you have to be very technical and you have to have that operational skills and technology and kind of, a lot of traditional come up through the ranks of, the IT administrator, server admin,
mhm,
hardware type model. But then you also have the governance, the risk management, all of that piece of it. And, they're looking because there's a friend of mine here in Nashville, and, she's like, yeah, she goes, I'm over both of those. And she's like, right now there's three of us, and she's luckily getting to a bigger team, but she's like, I'm logically splitting those out to two different distinct groups. I'm like, yeah, but you as the head of that, need to have that understanding of both. And it's difficult to find somebody that has all of that and can say, yes, I can lead. I often wonder, is a CFO really, are there like multi things that they have to have learned and come up with? Do they need an engineering background as well as a financial background, to do what a CFO does, or is it just distinct to the information security industry that you have to have both that technical and that more project management, risk management type of background.
Yeah, I mean I think we see that in some of the like HRIS because HR, you think about HR in terms of having tough conversations and benefits and annual reviews and those types of things, but they have a lot of systems that they need to support for that. And I've toggled on some of them, but the closest I've been to an HR role is HRIS. So looking at those, but mastering the systems that go into all of the HR support is a task on its own, and it is a separate area of expertise.
Right.
And the finance is absolutely the same way. You need to have people who understand not just the different financial systems, but how they plug in and how they connect, and how all the funds and the information is transferred from one spot to another. And that is its own area of expertise.
Right.
I haven't specifically heard of like a finance information systems, but
But I
if
mean,
that's
even
something.
like your chief people officer, does your chief people officer need to be that HRIS expert and a talent acquisition person and benefits and the people management? It seems like,
Mm-hmm.
does your chief people officer need to have all of those skills and all of that background, or is it okay to have specialties in that and your chief people officer comes from one of those? Because for me, it seems like with a CISO, people are like, nope, if you don't come from the infrastructure, if you're that risk manager,
Mm-hmm.
that you're not really, you call yourself a CISO, but you're not really a CISO. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, but if you're strictly looking at operational, you're missing a whole huge chunk of what a CISO needs to be managing. I don't say you have to be the expert at it, but I always wonder,
Yeah.
because it seems like if you read a job description, if you go on LinkedIn and read a job description for a CISO, they want
Mm-hmm.
everything. And
Yeah,
you're like,
I would like to see more universities focus on the non-technical side of the information, so the information office, we'll call that, that basically the IT, the infrastructure that goes into a business. Because great, yes, there's a lot of certifications and things you can get, Microsoft and whatever, but there are huge gaps on education and certifications as far as how do you actually manage like the strategy for the way you're managing your equipment. Not yes, here's the equipment, it goes in, it goes out, I have to check it, here's this, but why do you manage that way? And this is what the leadership needs to be figuring out the whys. What makes the most sense? Why do I need why should I approach equipment management this way versus another way? And how do I really look at assessments? Which assessment do I need? Right? So where are the courses on HITRUST versus ISO 27001 versus SOC 2 versus PCI versus NIST? So we know that there's a fair amount of overlap with the controls that they have. But where are the certifications that a CISO should probably have that says, I understand enough about all of these parameters to make a very specific recommendation and guide the organization in the right direction to know which one of these frameworks is going to be best for us, with a roadmap on here's where we are now, that's where we need to go next year, and on we go. Right? A lot of people end up in situations where they're just using the one that was there or the one that they
mm-hmm,
used at their last role because that's what they're familiar with.
right.
And that means we've got a lot of organizations that possibly are not getting the frameworks that are best aligned with their needs, because the people in those roles know how to, move it through, but not why that one was chosen.
Well, the whole asking about IT strategy, especially in the hardware realm. Do you think that's why cloud environments have become so popular? Because I know in a traditional data center, you always had to worry about capacity. And that
Mhm.
was one of the things that you'd ask as an auditor. You'd come in and go, okay, what about your capacity management? And they'd be like, the what? And it's like, well,
Mhm.
come on, you've got to have, I know you look at CPU utilization on a server level, but don't you extrapolate that out to your storage and your,
Mhm.
network computing and things like that? And it just seemed like, is that kind of why cloud got so popular, is because there's somebody there kind of helping you do that and just saying, well, don't worry about capacity, because when you need more capacity next year, we'll just bump your contract up a little bit and give you the
Oh
compute
yeah.
power that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why startups have, gone that direction exponentially, because they can, tap into a little bit and then grow some more. And then all of a sudden they can just absorb that, growth on capacity straight through the cloud provisioning, which is amazing and certainly helps them. But that goes with almost anything, whether it's more users, more capacity for data storage. And, a lot of the organizations are just built to springboard, really. If you want, if that's where your business goes,
Mhm.
they can go, yeah, all right, no problem, just for fun. But yeah, I would like to see the CISOs really expand on the areas of expertise. I've spoken with a few who get frustrated, like you and me, in terms of how do we properly demonstrate the expertise that we have, right? So we've got high trust expertise. High trust doesn't have that certification that fits what we do. And I would like to see it, because, give me a course that's got all these frameworks and how to manage it. How do you project manage an assessment? Where is that course? I'd like to teach it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But I'd also like the certification that goes with it, so that people are like, oh yeah. So we can just look at a few certifications to give us, confidence. Even if we don't know this person, we
Hmm.
know that she likely knows what she's doing. And be able to demonstrate. It's the same with security posture. Why do we get all the assessments and certifications? So that we can communicate that
Hmm.
security posture to people who don't know us. And that way they don't have to come in and, look under all the rugs all by themselves. They can look at that and go, oh, okay, yes, this is the framework used, this is how it was validated. And then we can get that report to understand exactly what's happening and where any exceptions might exist.
Well, because
If it's
you're
me
talking about
for my role.
certifications. Well, you're talking about certifications, and I know, like, I've got the CISM, and I know there's the CISA, but
Mhm.
those are very generic when it comes to, it's basically how do you approach an audit? How do you conduct and perform an audit?
Mm.
Not necessarily a audit facilitator, but more
Mhm.
from being the auditor. So I'm kind of
Yeah.
wondering, like, would ISACA or ISC squared or anybody like that, or like even Cloud Security Alliance, have something that would
I
be a
haven't
good track? Yeah, no.
Yeah, I haven't found anything. The closest I've got are where they do start providing some context when you have internal audit departments, but that's still as an auditor,
Right.
not as a project manager for the team being audited. So that's different on
Mhm.
how you approach that and how you manage things, how you have conversations with the auditors, where you need to share information, where it's considered, you know, the auditors asked for something and you have an obligation to only share what the auditors have asked for. However, there's a fine line between sharing what the auditors have asked for and excluding information that is a material difference on the statement you then provided, right? So people need to understand, like, what does that look like, and then how to have conversations with the assessors so that you don't then waste 2 weeks going down a rabbit hole that should never have been opened in the first place because there's nothing there. But you had somebody who wasn't used to talking to assessors and they were like, well, then I did this thing. And they're like, well, I didn't really do that thing. And the assessor's like, wait, I heard that you did that thing. So now I have to explore that thing because that's my obligation as a licensed auditor. I have to go and explore that thing because you said you did it.
Right.
right? That's but this is where it would be really helpful to have people, you know, going through this process where I'm getting brought in to a lot of different companies to help guide this. It would, I just, I can teach it, I can teach their teams, but it would be really useful to start plugging some of this into university programs for folks. It can be a certificate. It doesn't need to be a whole degree,
Right.
but
Yeah.
where somebody has worked up to the point where they're going to be a CISO, there should be certain business management areas of expertise, whether it's how to run an assessment, how to make sure that you can communicate effectively about what's happening in information security to other areas of the business and know how it impacts them. Changing something in information security, if you go from one framework, one security framework to another for an assessment, there's quite a bit that's going to be different there. Where down to background checks, that's HR. And then how do you onboard people and how do you offboard people? HR, IT,
Right. Yeah. Because the offboarding and onboarding is both now a shared, you always think of HR, but you're like, well, no, there's an IT component of it too, especially with the
yeah,
logical and physical access to things.
yeah. And payroll is usually finance and HR
Right.
because there is a check and balance, two people reporting up to different executives in most cases. I think that's what the auditors, well, that's what the finance auditors like to see is two people
Hmm.
reporting up to different executives. And there's a check and balance, right? Here are the people we're paying. This is how they validate that. HR goes, here are the people we've employed. So those
Exactly.
things should match.
Exactly.
Right. But that this type of thing happens in a lot of places. The person running the assessment shouldn't necessarily be part of the information security or IT area. So a CISO is an interesting role because are they expected to run it? In smaller organizations, it might be quite
Hmm.
appropriate for them to do that. Slightly larger organization, it might not be the same level of appropriateness for them
Yeah.
to run it. It might be
Well, I
somebody
mean, I
else,
just
but
see even in a small organization, you've got like an HR team, you'll have probably 10 to 15 people, in an
Mhm,
organization of less than 1,000, and
mhm.
your information security is usually one, maybe
I
two.
know.
And you're like, okay,
It's
the
terrifying.
finance gets a handful, HR gets a handful, or like, why is the information security get one? And you're like, you're supposed, and that's where I think my frustration comes in, because you're supposed to be expert in all of it. And you're
Mhm,
like, well, typically you have either you're very good with the compliance or you're very good with the operational. And,
mhm.
it's like to find somebody that can do both. And that's probably why there's so much burnout. I mean, that's my surmise. That and the
Yeah.
fact that it's if you're not good at the compliance piece, you're not good at showing that that risk is actually not yours. The risk is actually the
Mhm.
business owner's risk, and you're just helping draw that out, document it, and getting them to understand the risk they're taking with the decisions that they're making in their roles.
Yeah. And making sure that it's not, this isn't I try to encourage people to look at this as a way to make informed decisions,
Hmm.
right? This isn't me telling you can't go down that road
Exactly.
or that was a terrible idea, but this is a means of, highlighting risk because at one point I held the role of a head of risk and compliance. It was a established organization, I would say mid-size, dual countries, but really encouraging people to look at different components of it and saying, right, okay, well, we can go down this road, and here's what that looks like, and we can go down this road, and here's what that looks like. So, when asked for a recommendation, it was honestly single piece of paper works brilliantly with recommendations that you have to justify or that you're going to need to look back on and go, well, I made that decision based on the information I had at the time, and here's what I knew. So that's where that document comes in super handy because you're like, this is what I knew, like those 3 to 5 bullet points, that's what I knew, and these were the key influences for why of these 3 choices this one was recommended. And then that governance committee magic comes again, and that's where the committee can roundtable that conversation and vote. And
Hmm.
then it doesn't fall to one person going, What do I
I hope it
do?
works. Yeah.
Like
Right.
this impacts so many different people. What if I get it wrong?
Right.
Don't shoulder it yourself.
Right.
Make sure you've round tabled it. You've had a conversation with other key stakeholders, and that's where your committees, I've just kind of brought us back like 30 minutes to our committee and council conversation. But that's where those things are really
Mhm.
useful. And that's where the CISO in particular has to make sure that they're not just heads down about just the information security, the IT side of the house, but they're actually looking around and going, oh, okay, this is how my area of the business impacts everything else.
Right.
And these are the people who are relevant to some of the key decisions that I need to make or that we need to make.
Yep. And
I like it.
understanding it's not ultimately your decision as the CISO. You're just the enabler of that conversation and that decision point. And I
Yeah.
think that's where it gets
Well,
lost a lot of times.
yeah, you should have I often encourage people to have an opinion, one that you can justify, but to
Hmm.
have an opinion on it, because the leadership team, if once you kind of get out of a specific remit, the leadership team aren't experts in everything else. They want to hear the recommendations, understand why that one is better from one person's perspective than another. I mean, you can
Yeah.
debate it, and that's fine, but it's hard, and you've got to be able to do that. And that's where the simple process of just like write down your three options
Yeah.
and what top line, right? This isn't a full report. It doesn't need to be
Right.
even 5 pages. One page is usually sufficient.
But ultimately, it's their risk to take.
It's their risk to take. And the way that risk is managed at, say, a small organization versus a medium-sized organization versus a publicly traded company, it's totally different.
Hmm.
At a small organization that is owned by one person, I see people struggle coming in from larger organizations into this environment because this person will say, this is what I want to do. And then they're like, but that's not good. Well, they own the business. So it is their call. And whether or not you agree with it, they get to decide it.
Hmm.
Yes.
And there
Yeah.
isn't anybody to complain
There's no
to or
committee
to
to go
raise
to.
it
Right.
to
Yeah.
Right.
because it's their company. They own it all by themselves and they can, shy of breaking the law, they can do whatever they want with that company.
Right.
And I see people really struggle. And then they go from single decision makers at a small company, and you go to a publicly traded company, and somebody's like, well, just because one person said it was okay, why would you think you could
Right.
just go
We're
ahead
going
and
to
do
need a
it?
committee meeting for this. Yeah.
But
And we're going to have
I
to
guess,
plan that.
can I ask the question, being consultants,
Mm,
when you give a recommendation and you really just disagree with what the owner says?
mhm. Yes. So I have often been in that position, and
Yes.
I will represent and say, here is what I believe would happen with this. Here are the risks, So
Yeah.
if they've gone down, they're very excited about a certain path that I wouldn't recommend.
Yeah.
And unless I'm asked for a specific recommendation, I often use the word suggestion, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to suggest this, I'm going to suggest that, because it is their choice,
Yes.
absolutely their choice.
Yes.
And so I'll go in and I will let them know what I think the risks are of that particular thing. And then I will figure out how to help manage that risk. They're going to go down that anyways. They
Yeah.
have something in their head that says this is the right decision for the business. Most business owners aren't out to destroy their businesses.
Sure. Right.
So there is something,
Mhm.
and understanding that perspective and then just figuring out how to get on board, right? At the end of the day, and I've often told that, I've said this to my own bosses for years. I
Yeah.
said, look, I said, I may disagree with you and I'll bring it to you and I'll say, I think this is a better decision than this one for this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, once you make the call, I am on board. I will
Yeah.
get on board. I will figure out how to manage the risk and mitigate what I think might be negative impact, and on we go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's
You
it
have to
is the
just
compensating controls, to see what other parameters that you're like, okay, if I think this is the risk and they're willing to take that risk, how can I shore up maybe some other vulnerabilities in that decision
Mhm.
and move forward? Maybe
risk.
it's a vendor that they've chosen over a vendor that I would have preferred or something like that. And I'd be like, okay, well, maybe there's some insurance we can purchase, or maybe there's some additional training that we can do, or something like that. And
Good call.
just security awareness. I think I always look at people that are, you're the first and last line of defense, and
Hmm.
it truly is. Even a bad decision can hopefully be mitigated, or when my fear comes to fruition, can be brought up and dealt with earlier if people are trained on what that is. I used to always think as a project manager that, I was a successful project manager if my projects ran perfectly. And I was always so frustrated because none of my projects ever ran perfectly. And then I
Right.
finally
That's why we have
realized,
jobs. They don't
yeah,
run perfectly.
exactly. Then I realized, I was like, well, if they ran perfectly, they'd be like, why do I need you? And
Hmm.
so I started realizing that my role wasn't to make sure that they were perfect and everything came and started on time and ended on time. It was to know when things started going badly or started slowing down or progress was being destroyed, to be able to see that quickly, raise it, figure it out, and then get us back on that track. And I'm like,
Mhm.
that is the successful project manager, is to find those issues quickly, early, and fix them. And I would probably do the same thing if it was okay, you took the riskier path than the path I would have chosen. Well, let's make sure that if we see that risk starting to come to fruition, we get on it early and say, is there
Mhm.
any way we can back off of this? Or do we
Yeah.
just, let go of the reins and whatever happens, happens. It's typically not of either or like that. It's typically not you made the decision and now the risk is going to be realized. But
Well, what you can do too is also dive down and the path of KPIs or BPOs. So KPIs, key performance indicators, BPOs, business process objectives. So really understanding how you're going to measure the project, how you're going to
Mhm.
track it, how you're going to monitor it, how you're going to measure it, and any executive dashboard should, and I know people are like, oh, another
Another dashboard.
dashboard with KPIs. I totally get it. And I've seen a lot of really useless ones. So I am not going to defend every executive dashboard out there. But dive in. How am I going to track this? So, and I think sometimes those situations where you disagree with the path they're going can be really good for identifying what those performance indicators are. In any given situation, find someone, if you can, who disagrees with the choice made, because they will be able to give you what they would be measuring. And that
Hmm.
can be a really good way to track and make sure that project stays on track, because either what they said is going to turn out not to be a risk, or it's going to turn out to happen. And is so if you're focusing on that, just doesn't have to be the only KPI you track, to be clear. But if you include that and you go, right, okay, well, here's a KPI that will help us measure risk, because we knew that this was one of the risks, and we're just going to, keep an eye on that. And then here's another one that helps us measure how successful we are, because we think we're going to sign like all these new clients. And so we want to know not just how many clients we signed, but how big contracts are, and, that sort of thing. So really delivering on the KPIs and the BPOs for a specific initiative, regardless of whether or not you agreed with the recommended approach, can be a great way to just help a project stay on track. We got very sidetracked there.
Oh no, and well, I was just thinking that, even if it's a decision that I do agree with, finding the person who doesn't necessarily think it's the greatest decision and having that conversation is probably very valuable, because
Mm-hmm.
they're obviously keying in, unless they're just a naysayer no matter what, but typically they would be keying into something that they may not even be able to articulate, but you could be like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, when would you start feeling nervous about this? Or,
Mm-hmm.
or when is that I told you so moment going to come?
Yeah. That's a relationship builder too. I will tell
Yeah,
you that, because they
exactly.
will
Yeah.
feel heard. They will feel like you are respecting the fact that they disagreed with the direction taken, and that you're taking their concerns seriously. Really big things, huge. So find that person or people, take on board what they've said, track it, and like I said, the risk is either going to happen or it's not.
Yeah,
That's
great question,
where
Jeff.
where I drive the projects for assessments, and I'm tracking how many controls do we have, or how many pieces of evidence do we have to collect, and then driving down to that next tier, which is, all right, how do they spread out among the teams? How many people do we have on each one? What's the velocity we need to cover on a day-to-day basis in the time that we have? That can be very helpful, instead of just going, folks, we're not moving fast enough, or the leadership team are asking, are we on track to, hit the submission target? Unless you're tracking velocity, you have no way of knowing.
Yeah, and velocity by team or team member, because somebody may
Mhm.
be getting through
Yeah,
all of their stuff, but there's 4 or 5
absolutely.
critical pieces that it's maybe a longer cycle to get that data, and you need to know
Hmm.
we've got to start on that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Because IT might be knocking it out of the park because they do these assessments all the time. But if you've got, a new person in HR who's like, I don't, what is, what is high trust? I've never done this before. This was not part of my HR training program. I don't imagine it would have been. So, that person's going to need a little bit more coaching and more lead time on getting that evidence for you, because they don't necessarily have experience to draw on. And especially where you've got some of those new teams, that's where, weekly meetings just with that one team, not with the whole team, because otherwise they'll get drowned out by IT folks and they won't want to speak up, because as I've seen in those dynamics, basically, if you've got a heavy IT, group in a meeting and they're talking about things that, are about protecting IT, a lot of the other folks will feel uncomfortable about raising something that might be obvious to the folks in IT, but is not obvious to them. And so smaller meetings can be very useful. Sorry, we've gone over. Um,
No worries,
Very
no
exciting
worries.
conversation.
Exactly, good
Awesome.
conversations. But all right, so we will wrap this up and see you next week.
That sounds good.
All right, bye, thanks.
Bye.
See ya.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.